And it's all yours, Johnjoe.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Ken. So, what I'm going to be talking about today is the conscious electromagnetic information field theory. And it's a theory that I've been working on and off. It's not my full-time job by any means, working on this. Mostly I'm a molecular biologist, became microbial geneticist and then systems biologist and worked in quantum biology area. But for a long time, I've had an interest in what consciousness is, and the what we'll do is explore the theory and why I think it's a good theory of consciousness. And as it's a fairly small and um, uh, which is great kind of gathering. If you feel like interrupting, just do so. If something isn't clear, I'm perfectly happy to take questions during or after the presentation. So here we are. So these, I thought I'd start with the what makes consciousness a problem at all. And of course, the most important one, the biggest one, if you like. Well, I wouldn't say it was necessarily the most important, but the hard problem is why is anything conscious? And particularly the stuff inside our heads, which we know is conscious, and it's the only thing we really can be certain about. But that's a hard problem. Next, we'll go through these very briefly, and then we're going to look at each in turn. So the binding problem, um, why our conscious mind is serial, what correlates with consciousness and why, where is the brain's global workspace, what is free will, and why isn't AI conscious so far? I think most people would agree that it isn't. So we'll start off with the binding problem. And what is this? And I illustrate, there's lots of ways of illustrating it. Normally it's illustrated with a picture and saying, or looking at a landscape outside your window, say, and saying, and asking the question, how does all that stuff in your conscious mind get fused into a single percept of that view? But it's also embedded in language. And here's a line to move this over here so I can read it properly. Line of Shakespeare, one of our chaps over here. Love is a smoke made with a fume of sighs. And what does that mean? It's kind of nonsensical in a way, but we understand it. That love is a kind of diffuse thing that we can't kind of pin down, and the fume and fume also evokes that kind of feeling that it's distributed, and then sighs because it's often sad. Um, and we put that together in our minds to understand a line of poetry like this. And all poetry depends on this ability of binding different ideas together. Just like paintings bind different ideas together, and music, we bind together the notes of a chord, for example. Binding is fundamental to consciousness. But then there's another thing that we do in our conscious mind, and that is solve problems with it. And this, we solve problems that are difficult for computers to solve. And Gary Marcus, one of the deep learning pioneers, wrote a very interesting article. I can't remember if it was entitled or it certainly featured the problem of what's the best way to fix a bicycle that has a rope caught in its spokes. And what he pointed out was you can give this puzzle to a 5-year-old, 6 or 7-year-old child, and on first exposure, they will be able to solve it just by looking at it and going to it and solve that problem. But no computer then, when he wrote this, and I think no computer now, starting from scratch, in other words, not starting like ChatGPT does from the web, starting from scratch could look at a problem like that and solve it. Even on thousands or millions of trials. So Gary Marcus said, and he knows this better than me. Um, and this is what we call general intelligence, the intelligence of putting things together in our mind, working out how to do things in our conscious mind. Well, obviously, we solve lots and lots of problems in our non-conscious mind, things we don't have to think about, like walking and speaking. I don't really, um, uh, I'm not conscious of the motions of my lips and tongue and larynx when I speak. And I'm also not conscious of even the grammar that I'm using. We're able to operate and do these kind of things entirely non-consciously. And how do we do it? So the binding, and all of these involve a certain amount of binding. You have to solve the root problem, we have to kind of turn it in our mind, which means we have to keep the whole object joined up. And all of the other big problems that consciousness can solve, but computers can't, tend to involve binding. And it's also apparent in visual illusions, such as the impossible triangle. What substrate in the brain is capable of representing this object? It's clearly impossible. It's made up of different parts, but we put it together into our mind, even though it's an impossible object. We can still hold it in our mind. Now, the key feature that we have to bear in mind here is the impossibility of this triangle is only a property of the whole triangle, not any of its parts in isolation. So this is, and we'll come back to the triangle in a moment, but both of these feature holistic information, gestalts, as the Gestalt psychologists used to say, joined up information that can be manipulated mentally to confer understanding and meaning. And neurons encode discrete units of information in their firing rate, probably just a binary digit. They're either firing or they're not. So, for example, in this in the line of poetry, you could imagine that different neurons might encode size, love, fume, and smoke. How does it come together for us to understand the poem? And how does even the different letters of the word sigh come together in order to understand what it means? Where is the seat of joined up information in the brain? Information is physical. This is what Ralph Landauer insisted. And that is important when we consider how computers process information. The standard Boolean logic gates of computers, information processing, dissect rather than integrates information. So, for example, the eagle there can be dissected into different parts of the object. Its wings, its tail, its beak, its eye, etc. could be handled and dissected. But where does it come together? We can imagine if we could program a computer to look at an eagle or other birds and ask these kind of questions. Does it fly? Does it have feathers? Does it have eyes in front of its head? And that can generate an answer to the question whether it's an eagle or not. And a single processor can you see the pointer, by the way, cursor I'm using here? Yeah, okay.
Yes, we can see it.
I've got to switch to the other one, but this will do. Um, the so this final decision could be made by a single binary digit processor, and it could say, and it could give an output to a voice processor saying that is an eagle. But which in this computational network, where is the eagle as we see it in our conscious mind? Computers dissect the information and make decisions as to calculations or identifications on the basis of this kind of logical trees. But that splits up the information, and there's nowhere that we could see when it comes back together again. So neurons will do this as well. They seem to perform similar operations to digital Boolean logic gates. So we have the same problem in a brain. Where does the information come together? As shown, so this just shows the Boolean logic gates. And then we could ask the question, well, often people say, well, it's in the neurons, but what does a neuron know? Basically, all a neuron knows is whether it's firing or not. So that's all a neuron can ever know. And as far as we know, all it encodes is a single bit of information. Either it's firing or it's not. Could be it encodes more complex information, but it only outputs a single bit of information. As far as we know, the action potential only encodes this is an action potential, it has fired. So then the usual thing is, well, okay, a neuron doesn't know anything, but if you have a lot of them, billions of them as in the brain, then the whole brain knows. But I think that doesn't really make sense either. As Landauer said, information is physical. So joined up information must be physically joined up. And that isn't the same as the kind of integration of information that Boolean logic, tree logical gate trees generates because they dissect information. And one way of considering this is instead of having digital logic gates, you can imagine that problem of a bird, is it an eagle or not? You could give it to people who only see the previous upstream information. So one person may be standing there and waving a flag, and he'll see the eagle and wave the flag to say, yes, it's flying. Someone further down the tree, down here, will look at that signal, and then he has a question. Does it have feathers? And he sees the eagle and says, yes, it does have feathers. That signal is seen by the third person are the eyes in the front of the head. And this person waves the flag and says, yes, the eyes are in the front of the head. But each of these only incorporates one aspect of the information of the eagle. None of them actually, at least if there were neurons, they wouldn't see the information. They would only see whether it flies, whether it has feathers, whether it has predator's eyes, and nowhere is that information is brought together. Now, how is information integrated then in the brain? And the key insight is that it can't be in neurons because neurons only encode single digits as far as we know. So where else in the brain? And of course, fields integrate information. Our weight, me sitting on this chair at the moment, excuse me, is an integration of our my body mass with the mass of the entire planet and within the gravitational field of the Earth, plus all the objects on the Earth's surface. All of those components are integrated into my weight sitting on this chair. So the gravitational field of the Earth integrates all of the information of the mass of the Earth, also something of the mass of the moon and the mass of the sun even, and other planets is all integrated and available to us at the seat of our pants when we're sitting on a chair. And that's what fields do, of course. I think most of you guys are physicists, I believe. So you
Yes.
know this anyway. But so where in the brain is a field? And of course, there is a very famous field, the brain's electromagnetic field, which has been known for more than a century and is routinely used to assess states of consciousness in techniques such as EEG and MEG. They're widely used to assess whether a patient is conscious or not during anesthesia, or whether patients with disorders of consciousness are really conscious, for example, in comas. So it's widely used to diagnose consciousness, and yet mostly it's ignored, considered often as described as the whistle of a train compared to the engine of a train. The neurons are the engine, and that's where all the action is. The whistle of the train doesn't really make a difference to how the train moves. It's just there. EM fields are generated by EM electromagnetic activity in the brain, based in neurons, and this is they're just the brain's steam whistle. So this just illustrates how the brain's EM field is generated from action potentials and synaptic potentials. So the electrical activity of the brain generates its electromagnetic field. And it can be detected, of course, both inside neurons, in the extracellular spaces between neurons, and outside of the brain to a certain extent, certainly on the skull by techniques such as EEG. But it's usually considered to be not important for understanding how the brain really works. That just illustrates EEG, and let's see intracellular and extracellular potentials being measured in the brain. Okay, so back in 2000, myself and simultaneously Susan Pocket at University of Auckland, I believe, in Australia, in New Zealand, came up with the idea, well, why not locate consciousness in the brain's electromagnetic field? It's equally physical as the brain's matter. As you guys know, all matter particles are all excitations of fields, whether EM fields or the strong and weak fields, the Higgs field, etc. So fields are the underpinning of all physical phenomena, and yet we ignore them when we come to think about what consciousness is and how the brain works, are largely ignored. So myself and Susan Pocket, I haven't put her reference in there, but first we both described this theory or a variant of this theory in books in 2000, and then both wrote letters to Journal of Consciousness Studies in 2002, and we've since been publishing ever since. And many more electromagnetic theories of consciousness have since been described, must be at least 24 of them now, which are recently described in Tam Hunt's review, along with other people in 2024. So now there are many electromagnetic theories of consciousness, not just us. And what I want to emphasize by this slide is why I think so many people have problems with it. Because with EM field theories of consciousness, because they see the visible matter of the brain. The EM fields are invisible, and to biologists, at least, and most people, they don't really consider the invisible fields that surround us as being causally active, despite the fact, as I said, the gravitational field is obviously causally active. And this is illustrated or the peculiarity. So the standard hypothesis is the brain's matter is the substrate for consciousness. And what I want to get over is it is just as bizarre an idea, in fact, probably a more bizarre idea, to consider that meat, which is essentially what brains are made of, is conscious, than to consider the EM fields generated by the electromagnetic activity of that meat is conscious. And this is illustrated, a short story by the author Terry Bison, sci-fi author, about aliens who discover a civilization in some far-flung galaxy, and one of them comes back and they say, what are these sentient beings made of? And the answer is they're made of meat. Meat? No doubt about it. We picked up several of them from different parts of the planet, took them aboard on recon vessels, and probed them all the way through. They're completely meat. And this was, to these aliens, was considered bizarre. How can anything intelligent be made out of meat? And it is extraordinary. But I think it's less extraordinary if you consider that it's not actually the meat, it's the electromagnetic fields made by that meat. So, okay. So we're going to ask some of the questions. Why is our non-conscious mind we're going to explore some of the questions that I put up in one of the first slides. Why is our non-conscious mind parallel, but the conscious mind a serial computer? And that's easy to answer because matter in brains or computers is discrete and localized in space. So it supports parallel but non-conscious information processing. All the information processing that goes on computers goes on in different circuits. It can easily process information in parallel. But EM fields are always unified. There is only a singular electromagnetic field in the brain. And because of interference effects that you guys are very familiar with, they can never work in parallel because there's always interference. If different computations are going on, they are always interfering with each other. So we would just that information and knowing that our conscious mind is serial. And you can see this, for example, if we're reading a book, we can't read a book and watch a film at the same time. Why not? A computer could easily do that. We can't do a crossword and talk to someone at the same time. Obviously, we can switch rapidly between them. So it's not entirely obvious, but if you think about it, you can't do two things at once in your conscious mind. And why is that? Our non-conscious mind is very parallel, and it does lots of things like me talking involves the manipulation of probably hundreds of muscles. My brain's got to generate grammar, which is a very complex computation, and yet I don't think of any of it. So it works lots of things in parallel. But our conscious mind, you can't even, most of us can't throw two balls in the air and do juggling. It takes a lot of training to do that kind of thing, or to operate our fingers on a keyboard independently. It's really, really hard and takes a lot of training. So, and that training drives those skills, like playing a piano. Initially, it's dong, 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 dong. You have to do one thing after another. But when you're sufficiently trained, like professional musicians, they don't think about it anymore. So they have to drive that parallel processing from their conscious mind, which they can't really operate. They have to do it in serial to begin with, into their unconscious mind. And then they can do those operations. So that's a feature of consciousness that we don't often think about, but it is a clear feature that there is this difference between the conscious and non-conscious mind. And yet they're both made of neurons. So according to most conventional theories of consciousness, they both believe both of those types of computations are performed in the matter of the brain. And many people have wondered about this for a long time, and no one's come up with a good idea based on the matter of the brain, because there's no evidence of any kind of distributing of different tasks as complex as this in the brain, in the conscious mind. Okay, so that's one of the problems answered. The binding problem we've looked at. And now why the non-conscious mind is a parallel processor, whilst the conscious mind is serial. And then you can ask, okay, well, Crick, Francis Crick, proposed about 20 years or more ago that the best way into understanding consciousness is to look for correlates of consciousness. So what correlates with consciousness in the brain and why? Okay. Synchronous neural firing. There's no question, a lot of neuroscience over several decades has uncovered that the closest correlates to conscious thinking is when neurons fire in synchrony. For example, when we are looking, a good example is when you're looking something. I have a very untidy desk, and I might put my glasses down somewhere, and I'm looking at the desk, and I can't see it. I can't see where my glasses are. And then if I look long enough, aha, I'll get that aha moment when seeing my glasses. Now, prior to me seeing my glasses, the image of my glasses was being projected into my retina. The retina was projecting those signals with all of the information, the optical information from my glasses, that my glasses were on the desk, into my brain, but I wasn't seeing it. The neurons that were picking up that information weren't yet conscious. So what happens to the neurons when we become conscious of the information that they are carrying? They don't change their firing rate. They don't do anything different except that they fire in synchrony. That is what happens to neurons when we become conscious of previously non-conscious information in our brain. Our neurons fire in synchrony. And this was discovered by Walt Singer first in 1999, working on monkeys, when he was able to measure in individual neurons when they saw an object. And as I said, what he discovered, and you can see from the signals here, when the animals weren't seeing the object that they were needed to search for, I don't know, an apple or something, then the neurons recording the apple were firing asynchronously, but when they were conscious of them, they fired asynchronously. Now, why would that be? Why would it make a difference if all the information was processed just through the neurons? Why would the neurons care if they're firing synchronously or non-synchronously? How would they even know? Now, of course, there are ways of understanding that. Maybe there's some kind of downstream processor that identifies neural synchrony, but there's an easier one. If neurons are firing, most neurons in the brain fire asynchronously. So the electromagnetic waves generating the EM fields in the brain will cancel each other out by destructive interference. By chance, if neurons are just firing independently, they'll mostly fire asynchronously. So that means that EM fields will tend to cancel each other out, as in here, to generate destructive interference. Obviously not as complete as that, but they will generally average to generating no zero net field. But if neurons are firing synchronously, then you will get constructive interference. So now that information in those neurons will be projected into the brain's EM field, whereas the information in non-synchronously firing neurons will not be projected into the brain's global EM field because they will interfere with each other. So this gives a really simple and clear, and if once you accept that consciousness is embedded in the brain's EM field rather than its neurons, the matter of its neurons, then this explains why synchronous firing correlates with consciousness without any other need for invoking any other mechanisms. It just is predicted by the theory. So that explains the strongest correlates of consciousness. Brain's EM field will be dominated by information encoded in synchronously firing neurons, whereas the non-conscious activity will mostly not be represented in the brain's EM field. And there's another curious feature. The cerebellum, sometimes called the mini brain, it has 69 billion neurons. 10% of the whole brain, of the neurons in the brain, are in the cerebellum. It's also the activities of the cerebellum, despite being extraordinarily complex, are non-conscious. We're not conscious of its activities. And that's a puzzle. But a clue to that puzzle is it's impossible or really, really hard to get any EEG signal from the cerebellum. So why would that be? If we're not getting EEG signal from the cerebellum, it suggests it's not generating EM fields. And then you look at the architecture of the cerebellum, and it's made up of this extensively folded structures. And the thing about these is that they will tend to cancel each other out. The neuronal firing in one neuron will be cancelled out by the firing of if the same information is encoded in an adjacent neuron, it will be slightly out of phase. So that's why you don't see a signal from the cerebellum, because the EM fields that it generates the architecture of those EM fields is such that the EM field strength is cancelled close to zero because of the cerebellum architecture. And that means that they won't generate conscious information, because if the fields are being cancelled, what the cerebellum does, which is mostly about motion, will be non-conscious. Again, there's no, as far as I know, there's no theory of consciousness that explains that. IIT integrated information theory tried to, but it got trashed on the basis that the cerebellum was much simpler. But it isn't. It does just as many complex computations as any part of the brain. But it's easily explained in the EM field theories of consciousness. Okay, what's the next one? Where is the brain's global workspace? And The global workspace is the information that you have in your brain before it becomes a memory, a synaptic memory. We know that synapses certainly are involved in the coding of long-term memories. But when we look at a phone number and transfer it to our phone, we've got to have that information in our memory for a short time before we press the numbers. And we usually, if it's an unfamiliar phone number, it will usually be forgotten in a few seconds, or certainly in a minute or so, we'll forget that number. So where is that information while it's in this uh, in this temporary store? And that isn't answered in any clear way in any neuronal theory of consciousness, because we're conscious of our working memory. It's definitely part of our conscious mind. It's the things we see and then forget. But there is nothing special about working memory as far as we can see. The memories are still encoded when they are when we are thinking about, say, I don't know, an apple. Certain neurons will fire in the normal way, but we don't make synaptic connections to make permanent memories. So where is that going on? Where do we see this? Where is this brain's global workspace? And of course, in electromagnetic field theories of consciousness, what we propose is that it's in the electromagnetic field in the brain. The electromagnetic field in the brain is constantly changing, but for a while it will hold the information, probably for seconds, probably not much longer than that. And the theory goes that that information is available and to any neuron in the brain, as we said before, the brain's electromagnetic field is singular. So all of the information in the brain is available to every neuron in the brain. So that's what we believe working memory is. And so the brain's EMF is the mind's global workspace. Is there any evidence for that? Yes, there is. Okay, let me see. Okay, so how we think the working memory works in the brain in terms of the electromagnetic field theory is it's like the EM field generated by a router, which any telephone in the vicinity of a room or a building may be able to utilize the same information and may be able to download the same information. And similarly, the neurons are generating information and holding in the brain for certainly seconds, and any neuron in the brain can have access to it. Okay. Now, what it explains is a peculiar feature of working memory, and that is called representational drift. In the time that the neurons will be firing in the time that a memory can be held in working memory before it becomes a permanent memory and it gets burnt into the synapses, the neurons that are firing change. So this is called representational drift. At time one, you can see 3 different neurons that may be involved in this working memory. This work was done on monkeys, so maybe they were remembering, say, a banana. And the neurons that are firing, remembering that banana, at time 1, and a few seconds later, at time 2, will drift. There'll be a different set of neurons. Now, how does that work? How does a monkey keep a memory of a banana in its mind, and yet a wholly different set of neurons is now encoding that information? Well, what a remarkable study by a group based at MIT at the time, but now they're a bit distributed, Panotsis and Miller and others. They using the information of which neurons were firing, what they were able to do was compute the electromagnetic fields generated by those neurons. And what they found was, although the neurons were different, the electromagnetic fields were the same. The structure of the EM fields were what was retained during representational drift. The neurons may change, but the EM fields stay the same. And what they said is electric fields sculpt neural activity and tune the brain's infrastructure. And now they've become firm supporters of the idea of the consciousness being in the brain's electromagnetic field and working memory, the brain's global workspace, being encoded in the brain's EM field. And as far as I know, there's no easy, not even hard explanation of representational drift in any neuronal theory. How is it that the same information can be encoded by a completely different set of neurons during the time it's held in working memory? So let's go to another question. What is free will? I'm going to go into a bit of philosophy briefly. I have to move the images around to read this. So, okay, what is free will? I think a lot of the problems of understanding free will are to do with the term free will. What is free? We think of the usual philosophical problem is we think of as our will being acausal. It doesn't have a cause except in our mind. But this is a relatively recent view of agency, if you like, in humans. Most traditional views of human agency do not treat actions as freely chosen. Instead, they are seen as being determined by fate, destiny, or external, often supernatural forces. This is a painting representing Oedipus, and we know, sure we know the story of him, of Oedipus, that there was it was predicted that he would marry his mother and kill his father, and he knew of this prediction, and he did his best to avoid it, but eventually he ended up doing exactly that, murdering his father and marrying his mother. So the idea then was that you don't really have free will. You're under the control of other agencies or just fate. And if we think about it, what we understand, for example, as a way of thinking about it, I might decide to phone my brother. Now, I kind of think, does that decision to phone my brother, is it acausal in the sense there was no cause of it in previous inputs into my brain? Of course not. I may have seen something on the TV that reminded him of my brother. Someone may have, I might have seen a date and realized it was his birthday. So if we think about it, that isn't what we understand as will. What we understand as will is a difference between willed activity and non-conscious activity, like me waving my hands when I'm speaking. I'm not conscious of them. And we don't call that, we call these non-conscious activities certainly not something that is subject to free will. What we call free will is those actions that we make that are driven by our conscious mind. Now we don't, but if we think back to those actions, we'll very seldom find a blank when we decide to do something. Cook the dinner, for example. We'll look at the clock and realize, oh, it's 6 o'clock. I'll cook the dinner. That isn't acausal. So I think this problem of determinism and will is made up by philosophers. It's not really a problem because what we understand as individuals as free will is not acausal. It's just the actions that are driven by our conscious mind. So how are they driven by our conscious mind? Free will is the experience of the influence of the electromagnetic field of our brain on neurons. And I think if I got to, I've missed some slides out here. So somehow some slides got dropped, but there is a lot of information now, and I'll, if anyone's interested, I could send references demonstrating very clearly, and we've done work in our lab as well doing this, that EM fields, external electromagnetic fields, of similar strength and structure as the brain's endogenous EM fields will change neural firing patterns in, for example, brain slices. I think there may be a slide that will come that will give some references for this, but otherwise I could find something fairly quickly. But this has been demonstrated back maybe 2 decades ago, and lots of recent studies have been done. For example, some in which they actually prevented synaptic connections between parts of the brain and showed that electromagnetic signals will nevertheless cross those non-synaptic gaps and influence neural firing on the other side of the cut. So there's no question that the brain's electromagnetic field is causally active in the brain. And this is what I believe what we call free will is. The non-conscious actions, the non-willed actions, are those generated by asynchronously firing neurons that are doing things like forcing my hands to go here and there when I'm talking. And I don't think about those. They're non-conscious, so they're generated by asynchronously firing neurons, and they cancel each other out to generate zero net field of their activity, representing their activity. But willed actions are those which are generated by synchronously firing neurons. So the information in those neurons, and it's the field of those neurons that then drive via various intermediates our motor actions to deliver what we call free will, whether it's in speech or in actions that we intend to make rather than act non-consciously. Right. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I'll dig out a slide if we have time to give you lots of give you some references to the extensive evidence that EM fields are causally active in the brain. I'm preparing these slides, must have missed that, but anyway. And then so we've got what is free will. So the next question is, again, I have to move the images around. Why isn't AI conscious? And I think most of you are physicists, so understanding this theory, you will understand that it would predict that AI is non-conscious because electrical engineers don't like electrical interference. What I've proposed in, and other people have proposed in electromagnetic field theories of consciousness, is our brain has not been engineered. So the electromagnetic fields that it generated as brains became more and more dense. Eventually, electromagnetic fields generated by the brain started to influence brain activity, started to influence neural firing patterns, what electrical engineers may call EMF interference. And they take great pains to engineer it out of digital computers because it's a mess. It's hard to control, and so computers are built to avoid electromagnetic interference. So that means all of the digital computers around today do not have any electromagnetic field input into their computations. So they are the equivalent of our non-conscious mind, our neuronal mind. And just like our neuronal mind, which I believe is doing all the driving all the non-conscious, equally complex activities. Walking is an extraordinarily complex activity, as is speech. But so complexity is not a key to consciousness. Sometimes the simplest things, if we could be thinking the most lofty thoughts and someone stands on our toe and will be instantly conscious of the pain in our toe. So complexity does not equal, despite integrated information theory, complexity does not correlate with consciousness. But EM fields do. So if you engineer them out of computers, you will never get a conscious computer. But there are ways of building conscious AI, I believe, and that is by building hybrid digital EM field computers that have an architecture similar to the human brain. in which both non-conscious activities are performed by the wires, and conscious activities will be performed by electromagnetic field interactions, just as I think what's going on in the brain. And a paper I published only earlier this year described a very rough kind of approach to trying to deliver that outcome. Okay, what's next? We've gone back to the first question there. Often what's thought to be the hard problem. Why are we conscious? Why are we aware? And that's, I don't think any theory of consciousness will ever be able to fully answer that. Well, maybe once we have conscious AI, if we do have conscious AI, we might be able to answer that problem. But this is what Cemi field theory says about it. The experience of, for example, hearing middle C is what it feels like. Now, Nagel, 1974, asked the question, what does it feel like to be a bat? His answer was, we'll never know what it feels like to be a bat, because we can never get inside the mind of a bat. But we can get inside the mind of an electromagnetic field in the brain, because we are inside that mind of the electromagnetic field of our brain, such that the middle C, the note middle C, feels like to be on the what it feels like is to be on the inside of electromagnetic field encoding information that represents middle C. So the experience of hearing middle C is what it feels like to be on the inside of electromagnetic field information encoding middle C. Just as people thought, and most neurobiologists continue to, that what our brain feels like is what our conscious mind feels like. And when they're talking about brain, they're talking about the matter of the brain. So they think our conscious mind feels like what matter feels like inside the brain. I say what our consciousness feels like is what electromagnetic feels like from the inside. So not what information feels like by looking at it from the outside, but what an electromagnetic field encoding complex information, such as the note middle C, and how it resonates with all the other things going on in our brain to do with music, what that feels like. We are that electromagnetic field, in other words. So yeah, so that's, I think, where we come to a convenient time to end the presentation. So consciousness is the brain's electromagnetic field, and that's a Cemi field theory. And as I said, many other EM field theories have since been proposed. And I think that's oh, and the other point I make is these are the problems of consciousness. And as far as I know, and if anyone wants to prove me wrong, no other theory of consciousness comes anywhere near to explaining all of these unique features of consciousness. The ones that we've been looking at. The hard problem I would say is we still don't know why EM fields of a particular construction in the brain, why they feel like anything. But sometimes we have to kind of admit that the one thing we know about consciousness is that something in our brain is conscious. So there is a physical, something feels like what it is to be a conscious mind. And that something is located inside our skulls. So you either got to put it on the matter of the brain, and then you're swamped with lots of problems, or you put it in the field of the brain, and it now solves all of these fundamental problems of consciousness. So I think the most sensible and simplest answer is that our brain's EM field is consciousness. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you.